Revolutions. These dramatic, emotional moments form the basis of so much of our concept of the world and of our governance. This is where the old meets the new, where the young wrestle control from the aged. In any nation, at any time, if the people are allowed to voice their feelings, then dissent and displeasure will be found surrounding those in power. There's always someone who thinks they can do a better job, that they can fix the world. In the revolutions we've studied, those revolting were filled with passion and with an optimistic outlook on the future. They had a vision of what they want their country to look like. Every one of these revolutions came with the promise of a better tomorrow. But as we explore several of the more well-known revolutions, as well as some with which you may not be so familiar, we can see that these visions simply did not come to fruition. Instead, though there may be positive ideological and indirect changes, we found that typically the direct results of a revolution are bloodshed, terror, and chaos, and often at the end of all of this pain is a result that nobody wanted. There are many factors that led to the French Revolution. The Enlightenment opened the door to new ideas of how society should be governed, and how a king fits into this modern way of thinking. Alongside that, the common people were poor, and there was a distinct sense of inequality rising within France. Nobles were often exempt from taxes, while the common folk paid taxes that they could hardly afford. Throw an incompetent and weak king on top of all of this, and the seeds of rebellion have formed. The events of the American Revolution, which we will discuss later, helped the French to realize that something could be done about these terrible conditions in France. France's revolutionary leaders dreamed of a France where everyone was equal and all men were free to live as they wished. A France in which a man's value was not decided by which social class he belonged to or whether or not he went to church. Instead, every man's rights were meant to be an innate part of the human experience. The precise events of the revolution are convoluted, but the overall revolutionary progress was gradual and inexorable. As more power was ceded to the revolutionaries, the focus slipped from creating a free and equal France into merely maintaining control over France using whatever means possible. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. This, alongside with the royalists who wanted the return of King Louis's rule, created an atmosphere of angst. The leaders of the revolution not only took advantage of this state of fear, they also exacerbated it by ruthlessly hunting down any who opposed their rule, thus granting this era the gruesome title of the Reign of Terror. These ardent advocates of democracy, who had revolted for the sake of freedom, had become the authoritarian dictators that they purported to hate. Instead of inviolable rights, the French experienced a brutal regime that used fear-mongering and the French revolutionary spirit to destroy its enemies, along with their citizens' freedom. This was not the democracy that was promised. In 1799, Napoleon deposed the revolutionary government and took the power of the state into his own hands, thus ending this revolutionary era in France. After all the blood lost during the revolution, governance in France merely went from a king to an emperor. Napoleon may have been a more competent ruler, but this was not the democracy for which France had bled. Despite the eventual futility of the French Revolution, the legacy of this attempt to create equality lives on. In the world today, there is an incredible amount of democracies around the world. Many of the ideas that these democracies embrace find their root in the French Revolution. That France itself is now a democracy demonstrates the power of the revolution. France's revolution was a terrible thing, but the ideological legacy of democracy around the world shows just how much is owed to the radical French. By the late 18th century, Haiti had been ruled in succession by Spain and France for well over a century. French economic interests in the Pearl of the Antilles ensured that Haiti's economy was well taken care of. Haiti's value largely came from its extensive exports of coffee and sugar. One expert estimates that around half the world's supply of both came from the island. France's interest in Haiti was assured, but as the events of the French Revolution took place, the European powerhouse was simply too preoccupied to keep a close watch on all of its holdings. Haiti's social structure created a systemic unhappiness. Prior to the revolution, Haiti's residents were distinctly classified into three groups: the whites, the free blacks, and the slaves. Despite numbering less than 1/10 of the slaves, the whites had the majority of the power. Economically, socially, and legally, they were the cream of the crop. The second group was the free colored people. This class consisted of any black or mixed person who was not a slave. These people often did own property in slaves, but socially and legally, they were considered to be inferior, and when the time came, many were happy to rebel. The last and most unfortunate class was, of course, the slaves. In general, slaves around the world are treated terribly. This was especially true in the Caribbean, and Haiti was no exception. This subhuman treatment, alongside terrible living conditions, lack of food, diseases, and overwork, led to a death rate that exceeded their birth rate. To account for these losses, more Africans were imported to take their place, and thus the cycle continued. It's easy to see why the Haitian slaves were unhappy with this arrangement, and why, in 1791, the revolutionary spirit created by the French Revolution found its way across the Atlantic as the Haitian slaves fought to find their own equality. On August 21st, 1791, the slaves of Haiti launched one of the biggest slave uprisings in history. The twists and turns of the battles that followed are too complicated to get a true understanding of in the short time that we have, but we should note that the success of this revolution was due in large part to the squabbling of Britain, France, and Spain. In addition to the fortuitous events surrounding the revolution, strong leadership from men like Toussaint Louverture enabled the slaves to push back against the French army. By the late 1790s, Louverture was successful enough in his attacks against the competing European powers that he named himself Haiti's Governor-General for life. This self-styled tyrant was suffered for a time, until 1801, when Napoleon sent a massive invasion force with the instructions of taking back Haiti. Napoleon's attacks were successful enough to convince Louverture and other Haitian generals to surrender. However, rather than surrender, the Haitian people as a whole merely adopted a guerrilla style of warfare. Fortunately for the Haitians, Napoleon's other enemies in Europe forced him to focus his attentions elsewhere, opening the door for Haiti's eventual independence in 1804. If ever there was sufficient reason for a revolution, then the conditions in Haiti fulfilled them. The Haitians were experiencing terrible conditions, and they fought back the only way they knew how. The freedom of the Haitian slaves was an incredible victory, and this victory spoke volumes to the surrounding Caribbean nations. But this war did not come without cost. Bonham Richardson, the author of a book detailing the history of the Caribbean, writes, "Few wars have been so completely destructive as was the Haitian Revolution, and few have been so influential for Caribbean peoples. The population fell from an estimated 500,000 prior to the revolution to half that at the end." Unquote. For the majority of Haitians that survived, the conditions that followed were likely better. However, this victory only applied to the people who survived. Alongside the price paid in blood, the Haitians were also not well suited for their own independence. The wealth for which they were previously known was destroyed along with their European ties. This lack of infrastructure has helped to lead to the poor financial state that the country is in today. Unfortunately, Haiti's history of slavery has also followed the nation. It remains one of the world's most slavery-ridden countries. The Global Slavery Index estimates that 100,000 slaves are in Haiti today. A sad reminder of Haiti's terrible history and of the bloody war they fought to prevent this very thing.